For the third reading today, I've chosen a piece from the book of Revelation from John, and it's my vision of a post-COVID-19 planet. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth had disappeared, and there was no sea anymore. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. It was prepared like a bride dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Now God's presence is with people, and he will live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death, sadness, crying, or pain, because all the old ways are gone." I did not see a temple in the city, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the city's temple. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, because the glory of God is its light, and the Lamb is the city's lamp. By its light, the people of the world will walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. The city's gates never be shut on any day, because there is no night there. The glory and the honor of the nations will be brought into it. Words inspired by God. The ancient Greeks had a name for planet Earth, or the spirit that energized it. They called it Gaia. And some years ago, a very famous scientist called James Lovelock created what he called the Gaia Hypothesis, the belief system that our planet is actually a living organism. And I totally agree with that. In fact, about 30 years ago, I had a very powerful vision of Gaia. And in this vision, it seemed like I was standing watching souls in front of God, and different souls were volunteering for different tasks, different missions, different incarnations. And this great soul called Gaia, raised her hand and said to God, "Send me. I want to go to the third rock from the sun in that solar system, and I will breathe life. And I will continue to breathe greater and greater forms of life until finally I manage to throw up a life form which will recognize its own divinity, and ipso facto, the divinity of all other life forms with which it shares the planet." And God sent her off. At that stage, that rock was about 1 billion years old, and she began to vitalize it and animate it. And over the course of 3.7 billion years, she threw up first a single-celled protozoa, and then marine life, and then amphibians, and then reptiles, and then mammals, and then hominids, and finally, about 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens. And Gaia said, "I think I've done it. I think this could be the species that could recognize its own divinity and recognize the divinity of all other life forms." Now, we're on the brink of it, but we're not quite there, because Homo sapiens had to become Homo sapiens sapiens, and Homo sapiens sapiens needs to become Homo spiritualis, because we haven't yet recognized our own divinity, and we certainly haven't recognized the divinity of all the other life forms with which we share the planet. And that's what I want to talk about. That's my topic for this morning. Over the last 3 homilies, I've tried to look at what's the invitation of our quarantine, of our lockdown. And the first Sunday I talked about what is the invitation as a family? How do we accept this invitation as a family and grow? I called it cellmates or soulmates. And last Sunday I talked about what was the invitation to us as a nation, whatever nation you have to be in right now. How would you take this invitation as a nation in order to grow? And I called it partisan politics, or co-creating. And today I want to go to the final stage. I want to talk about, as a whole planetary civilization, what is the invitation for us. And I call this homily today, Prison Planet or Paradise Reborn. And that's briefly what I'm going to try to do in this morning's homily. So I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to do a very, very brief history of humans on planet Earth. Secondly, I'm going to talk about understanding boundaries. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about Gaia's 7 bodies. And then fourthly, the future of Gaia. So firstly, a very brief history of Homo sapiens on planet Earth. If you were with us 2 weeks ago, I offered the exercise whereby I invited you to divide your own life into 7-year chunks, 0 to 7, 7 to 14, 14 to 21, and to look at who the main characters were in each of those segments, what the main events were in those segments, and what the great lessons for you were. And last Sunday, I tried to do the same thing for our country. I divided our history into 50-year chunks and looked at the characters, the events, and the lessons. And today I want to try and do the same thing for planet Earth. Now, it's a hell of a task to pretend in 20 minutes or half an hour to give a brief history of planet Earth. But I'm Irish, I'll try it. And so what I would like to do, instead of dividing it chronologically into segments, I decided to look at 5 different aspects of life on planet Earth, and then divide each of the segments chronologically to get some kind of a sense of the flow for it. And so the 5 subcomponents, or the 5 aspects I'll be talking about in this point, will be, firstly, I want to look at prehistory and what we learned from that. Secondly, I want to look at the evolution of language. Thirdly, I'm going to look at empires and their wars. Fourthly, religions and wisdom traditions. And then finally, science and technology. So for each of these subsections, I'm going to try to hit a few of the main items. And obviously, every one of you doing this exercise would do it very differently. You'd pick out different people, different players, different events, and maybe different lessons. So this is just to get you thinking. So firstly, prehistory. What can we possibly learn from prehistory? There are no records. Writing didn't exist. So how can we possibly learn from prehistory? And I think we can learn it actually 3 different ways. The first way we learn from prehistory is by looking at our mythologies, all of the mythologies of the world. Because mythology is the archived wisdom of a culture. Mythology is not just fanciful stories made up by primitive peoples who didn't understand science. It is not that. Mythology is much more interested in transformation rather than information. But in spite of that, mythology created community, it created cosmologies, and it had their own understanding of what science was, because science, basically, the word science comes from Latin, scientia, which just literally means knowledge. And from the very beginning, all cultures have how stories and why stories, trying to understand, science in some fashion. So we learn from prehistory by examining the great mythologies of the world. We learn from prehistory by looking at archaeology and paleontology. So through looking at the fossil record, we can figure out, the buildings that were there before history, began, the tools that people used. We can figure out even, from mummified skeletons, what the diet of particular people was, what they died from, diseases they suffered from. And so some of these buildings are really, really ancient. There's a place in Turkey at the moment called Göbekli Tepe, in which they've unearthed these phenomenal ruins of a great city with very sophisticated buildings that go back about 12,000 years. So paleontology and archaeology can tell us a lot about prehistory. And finally, a modern science called the science of genetics. If you've ever gone onto 23andMe, you can actually find out how the great migrations of prehistory happened. And you can trace it, that we came out of East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, and we migrated northwards and then eastwards into Asia and down into Australia and westwards into Europe and finally the Americas. So even prehistory tells us a lot of things, and we can learn a lot about our own personal origins. So that would be the first way we learn, about history, from prehistory. The second thing I want to talk about is the evolution of language. And in my opinion, language is the single greatest invention of human beings. I can't think of any other invention that surpasses the development, or the creation of language. However we came up with it, or however we were influenced by it. And it would divide language, obviously, into two pieces: oral language and then written versions of language. So Homo sapiens sapiens arrived on the scene about 200,000 years ago. And we were rational animals at that stage, but we didn't have language. We could think, but we could not think about thinking. So we couldn't, organize symbols in our own head, which is about language. So language is the ability to actually manipulate symbols intracranially. So we don't have to do trial and error to figure out what will work and what won't work. And there are three aspects to oral language. The greatest, linguist of the 20th century, a guy called Ferdinand de Saussure, talked about the referent, the signified, and the signifier. So you're walking, in the savannah in East Africa, and you come across this great creature with two big tusks like this. So that would be the referent. The thing in the real world would be the referent. But you create an image in your own head, and it can be part visual. You saw it. It can be part auditory. You heard it. Maybe you smelt it even. Maybe you had the courage to touch it. And so you're forming this image, which is called the signified. So it's your version of the referent, the outside world. And then you try to talk to somebody about it. And if you're Kalenjin, you're going to call it Belyot. If you're speaking Swahili, you'll call it Ndovu. If you're speaking English, you're going to call it an elephant. And so the signifiers are different from language to language, but they're trying to give you an image of the same kind of signified. So that would be like oral language. And that continued for thousands and thousands of years before we were able to somehow transcribe the thoughts of our mind and the words of our mouths into some kind of a visual format. And we tried this firstly, I believe, with petroglyphs and cave art. We had drawings on walls in caves or outside. And the earliest version we know of that is in a place in Spain called Altamira. And it goes back 35,600 years. The first kind of art, cave art, which was an expression, a kind of a written expression of the signified. Then it developed slowly, very slowly. The first real effort at writing happened in Sumeria about 3,500 BCE with a style of writing which was called cuneiform. And they wrote it typically on clay tablets. A little bit after that, the Egyptians came up with the hieroglyphics. But the problem with hieroglyphics and cuneiform was that it called for thousands of symbols. So very, very few people could master it. But then about the year 1150 BC, before the Common Era, the extraordinary Phoenicians came up with the alphabet. And they reduced all of these symbols down to 22 symbols, to 22 phonemes. A phoneme is the shortest piece of a word. It's smaller than a syllable even. So if you take, for instance, you take the word I, as in I am talking, I actually, although it's a single letter and a single syllable, it's two phonemes. It is ai, literally, as it's pronounced, it's ai, so it's two phonemes. So what they did was they had symbols representing the basic phonemes, the basic sounds that people in all languages made. So you could represent now in written form all of these extraordinary ideas. 22 symbols, the alphabet. It would be extended to 26 in a few other languages. So language had a huge effect. The development of language had an extraordinary effect on the evolution of life on planet Earth. So that would be the second chunk of the historical review. The third piece of the historical review I'm going to call empires and their wars. And empires weren't even possible, while we were still hunter-gatherers. We were small groups of 15 to 20 people in a little tribe wandering about hunter-gathering. It was basically with the advent of horticulture about 12,000 years ago, and agriculture, particularly with the ox-drawn plow, that even the possibility of monarchy or empire began. But the first great empire was the empire of Sumer, which was about 3,800 before the Common Era. Egypt was a little bit later. Egypt came on the scene about 3,100 BCE. And then the great Assyrian Empire about 2,500 BCE. So there's just one empire after the following the other, all of them knocking each other out for supremacy. So in quick order, what happens, and I'm talking particularly about the Levant, the Middle East, when I mention this, although I'll say something about Asia perhaps as well. So in the Middle East, you had the Sumerian Empire falling eventually to Assyria, and Assyria is the great empire for a long period of time. It is the Assyrians who in 721 BCE capture the 10 northern tribes of Israel and deport them, and are never heard of again. But the Assyrians were finally overcome by the Babylonians. And the Babylonians now march into Jerusalem, and they take the last two tribes, and they destroy the temple, the first temple, which was built by David about 400 years before that. But then in 539 BCE, the Babylonians are defeated by the great Persian Empire, and it rules the roost for about 200 years. And then about the year 331 BCE comes Alexander the Great, and he overcomes the great Persian Empire and conquers the known world at that stage. Rome comes eventually and overthrows the Greeks. And then it's one group following the other. In the Levant again, and the Middle East, you had the great Ottoman Empire beginning about the year 1300 AD. You had then more modern ones. Portugal has its empire beginning about 1415 AD, and they colonize Brazil, which still speaks Portuguese, and in East Africa they captured Madagascar, Angola, those areas. And then shortly after, about 1492, you had the great Spanish Empire. And the Spaniards would conquer most of Meso and South America and go eastward toward Philippines. And then the 1600s, you had the British Empire, on which the sun never set. They had colonies all over the world. America got into the act probably in 1898 with the Spanish-American War, because that represented a turning point in America's self-image and its involvement with the world. They got involved in a Cuban effort at self-government, so they got involved with Spain to wrest Cuba from Spain. Thereafter, they began to send, forces all over the world. They took some of the Spanish colonies like the Philippines and Guam, places like that. And then since then, we have troops stationed in 150 nations out of 195 nations in the world. So that was the American Empire. Way to the east, at the same time, you had a succession of Chinese empires beginning about 221 BCE. And then you had the great Mongolian Empire, with Genghis Khan, beginning about 1206 AD. And you had the Japanese Empire that lasted right down to the end of World War II. And so there's this constant empires overthrowing empires. We had World War I from 1914 to 1918, in which 20 million human beings died. And then we had World War II from 39 to 45, and 56 million human beings died in the conflict, and another 23 million died from diseases related to famine, during the war. In fact, the single greatest, bloodiest battle in human history took place, during that war. It was the siege of Stalingrad that happened between August of 1942 and February of 1943. And that one battle over 6 months, 2 million human beings died. So that's been the history of empires and wars. During that period, there's another aspect that's happening, and I'm going to call it religions and wisdom traditions. The oldest tradition in the world, the oldest religious tradition in the world is shamanism, and you find it all over the world. You find it in South America, you find it in Europe, you find it in Asia, Australia, it's all over the world. And it probably dates back to about 40,000 years ago. You find it all over. Of kind of mainstream, kind of modern religions, the oldest would be Hinduism, that dates back about 4,000 years. And then there's this extraordinary period in human history that is called the Axial Age, from about 800 BCE down to 200 BCE, in which there's this extraordinary flowering of wisdom traditions and religions. And so if I begin at the east, in China, you have Lao Tzu, being born around 550 BCE. You have Confucius around the same period of time. We move into India, you have Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, being born around 550 BCE, and a contemporary of his called Mahavira, the founder of this extraordinary, beautiful religion called Jainism, around the same period of time. Further west, still you have in Persia, you have the great prophet Zarathustra, founding Zoroastrianism. And then further west into Israel, you have this great flowering in Israel of beginning perhaps with Isaiah around a famous vision he had in the year 741 BCE. And then Jeremiah, who flourished about 600 BCE, and Ezekiel about 550 BCE. And you move further west, you have the great philosophers of Greece, beginning with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And so you have this side by side. Where Christianity begins around the year 33 and then becomes the biggest religion in the world right now as far as numbers are concerned. And 610 AD, you have the rise of Islam, which is now the second most populous religion in the world. So side by side with the wars and revolutions and empires, we have this religious, mystical impulse going side by side with it. And then finally, to look at the historical piece, I want to just look at science and technology. And I divide this into three pieces as well. I want to look at three revolutions. I want to look at the scientific revolution, at the industrial revolution, and at the information revolution. So the scientific revolution begins. I mean, science has been done as long as humans have been alive, trying to understand the world in which they live. But the scientific revolution with empiricism and experimentation begins really in 1543 with the extraordinary Copernicus and his heliocentric model of the universe, followed by, Galileo very shortly afterwards. And then you have people like Francis Bacon, you have René Descartes, you have Isaac Newton, all these great geniuses. And the agenda is the following always. Science is attempting to do three things. Firstly, to understand any phenomenon. Secondly, to be able to predict its recurrence. And thirdly, to be able to control it. So the agenda of science is always understand, predict, and control. And that's right down to our own times with geniuses like Einstein, relativity theory, and then quantum mechanics developing in the 1920s. So that would be kind of the scientific revolution and the effect it's had on our world. The Industrial Revolution happens about beginning around 1760. And now they're going to be using coal and petroleum, and you're going to have steam and electricity. And now you're going to have the locomotives driven by steam. You're going to have the great steamships coming across the Atlantic. It radically changes the equation. There's this huge movement among peoples from farms to factories, and this ability of mass production for manufactured goods. So the thing speeds up enormously and has tremendous benefits and tremendous costs for us. And then finally, you have the information revolution. So disseminating information widely. It begins probably with Johannes Gutenberg, 1440 in Germany, when he created the first movable print machine. And the Bible is printed. It had an extraordinary effect on European culture and through colonialism on world culture, the ability to create books at this level. You had, for individuals, the typewriter was invented in 1867. So now you could personally be able to send out messages to people. The word processor, was developed in 1969. The home computer, 1974. Search engines, the first great search engine, 1990. The internet, 1998, and then the World Wide Web in 2013. So we had this extraordinary explosion of the ability to be in touch with people through information. And then the final part of this for me would be the artificial intelligence revolution. I'd call that maybe the fourth revolution of our times, where, for instance, through surgical implants, you can really help a person. I just had eye surgery a few months ago. I had the cataracts removed and new lens put in, and now the sky is the bluest blue I've ever seen, and the grass is the greenest grass I've ever seen in my life. So you have this extraordinary ability to surgically enhance human capabilities. At the same time, there's this movement of transhumanism. Are we going to be actually supplanted by machines? The first stage will be some kind of cyborgs, which are amalgam of carbon-based life forms like human beings and synthetic ones, silicon-based life forms. And so there will be cyborgs, which are like hybrids between humans and machines, and eventually possibly a full AI, artificial intelligence, which may in fact take over from planet Earth. So there's a very, very quick kind of resume of history. The second point I want to make then, I'm going to call it understanding boundaries. Now, in my work as a psychologist, I haven't worked with children that much. Very, very infrequently have I worked with children. But the people who do work with children, particularly a child around 4 or 5, where they're pre-rational, there's no point in engaging in talk therapy with a 4-year-old child. And so art therapy is the way in which you try to get illicit information from the child about what's happening inside themselves and what's happening in their homes. And so very, very simply, if you ask a child to draw a house, 4 or 5-year-old child, you can learn a whole lot about the child's interiority and about their family dynamic. If you look, for instance, just very simply at the size of the house they draw, the size of the windows, whether there are windows in the house or not, and the size of them, the size of the door. Is there a chimney? And if there's a chimney, is there smoke coming out of the chimney? In other words, is the home a warm place psychologically and sociologically? You know, do they draw in a garden? Are there gardens and flowers around the house? Is the sun shining? And so you can tell a whole lot by just watching a child draw a house. Now, the same thing is true actually when you begin working with your dreams. I started working with my dreams in 1978. I was still living in Kenya. And at that stage, I loved to kind of design buildings. So I was designing hospitals and schools and churches and convents and rectories. And at that stage, I was actually designing a convent in Marigat in Kenya. And I was playing around with the designs. And the first dream I recorded ever was the design I came up with for the convent in Marigat. So it was a house dream in some senses. And so what I realized is that, you know, there are 3 basic elements when you dream about a house. It's in the archetype of the psyche, a symbol of the psyche. And the 3 pieces I focus on would be the walls, the windows, and the doors. And so you dream about a house at night, it's a symbol for your own psyche. So the walls represent your physical body, your sacred space. This is your sacred space. You dream about the windows are like our senses, that which kind of allows us to observe the outside world. And then doors are like, you know, how we invite people to interact with us, hugging or handshaking or whatever. So when you dream of a house, these are the messages that your own dream is giving to you. But there's a very interesting phenomenon. One of the most devastating personality disorders that you encounter as a psychologist is called a borderline personality disorder. And when you meet them as adults particularly, they oscillate wildly between adulation, you know, and anger. And they're very often they're suicidal people. So they oscillate wildly in their moods. And the etiology of it, according to psychodynamics, is that a child whose boundaries are not being respected as a small child. And we're not talking about child abuse here of any kind. We're just talking that there's no sacred space for the child, that there's no place the child can be alone or private. They're constantly being hounded, like kind of helicopter parenting nonstop. And what happens is the child who has a great love for the parents has great anger at the parents as well. So it leads to this extraordinary borderline personality disorder. Now, I believe that there's a societal version of that. And so I believe, for instance, that when you dream, you can dream of a house as well as a symbol of the family system vis-a-vis the outside world. And I want to look at those 3 elements again, the walls, the windows, and the doorways. And so the walls for me represent the boundaries around the family's domicile in your home, that there must be some kind of privacy against the outside world, some kind of protection from the outside world, represented by the walls of the house in your dream. And the windows allow you to observe what's happening in your neighborhood. And so in that sense, you can be aware of what's happening outside. And then the door is to control who may come in and who may not come in. Those who are invited and those who are not welcome for whatever reason. And so when you dream of a house, it can be a family system as well. And I submit that we're going to have a syndrome, and I'm going to call it surveillance personality disorder, where because of the times in which we live and the constant surveillance we're under, and now with the Internet of Things, our refrigerators and our washing machines are spying on us in a sense. They're picking up information which allegedly are going to tell you what's in your fridge so that you can go shopping. But in fact, everything is being monitored. And so I believe that as a society, we're soon going to see what I'm going to call a surveillance personality disorder, where the right to privacy is no longer there as a family system. And I would submit as well that the house can also be a symbol, not just of the individual psyche, not just of the family, not even of the, of this little neighborhood, but of a nation itself in the world of nations. And I did three same things. So what would the walls represent if it's a symbol of a nation? The walls would represent our borders, our ability to safeguard our citizens. The windows would represent international diplomacy, the way in which we interact with other nations like ours. And finally, the doors would be our immigration policy, so that we can control who comes and who does not come in. So our world community has to be like a family where sacred space is honored. The little child needs sacred space, the family needs sacred space, and the culture and the nation need sacred space. And the opposite has happened, particularly through colonialism. We've invaded people's place and culture and destroyed them. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 7,000 different languages on planet Earth. By the end of the 20th century, there were only 5,000 languages left. We lost 2,000 languages and cultures. And languages are not just the ability, to use a different word to point out to the same object in the universe. Languages create mindset, they create perspectives. And when you lose perspectives, you use this extraordinary ability of people to engage with each other. So there's a huge difference between engagement and enmeshment. And so we have to honor each other's cultures. There have to be walls and windows and doorways in our nations, that we respect each other in the same way that family respects each individual member of the family. That's my second point. My third point I'm going to call Gaia's 7 bodies. There's this beautiful teaching in Hinduism that we consist of 7 different levels of bodies, represented by the 7 chakras, which are like transforms that down the oscillation or the frequency from one level to the other. And so, for instance, Hinduism will tell us that there's the physical body. It's vibrating between 400 and 700 nanometers, between ultraviolet and infrared. And we can see that body. But that body dies at some stage. There's a second level of body, which is called the etheric body. And it's vibrating at a higher frequency. But sometimes you can see auras, you can see like the energetic glow around a person. And often saints will be represented with a halo around their head, showing this energy moving from them. There's a third level of body that they call the astral body, which is the place where, when the physical body dies, all of the information and wisdom and experiences of the lifetime just ended are kind of archived. Then there's a fourth level they call the mental body, which is the kind of Plato's ideal realm, the place in which we download great ideas. The fifth level of body they call the causal body, which is the place in which our abilities reside, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, all these kinds of things. The sixth level is Atma, or individual soul, and then the seventh level is Brahma, or cosmic consciousness. Now, I have a theory that that's equally true for the planet itself. That this, extraordinary planet that Gaia volunteered to animate, 3.7 billion years ago, that also has 7 different levels of body. And here's what they represent to me. Firstly, I'm going to call it the physiosphere, the rock itself, which was just basically a rock for almost 1 billion years before Gaia decided to animate it. So it's just basically a rock. That can be studied by physics and by chemistry. The second one, the etheric level of Gaia, is the atmosphere. So climatology will study that. That's literally the energy template of which the physical planet is a printout. There's a third level, a third kind of sheath or sphere surrounding that, and it's the biosphere. Now you have plants, animals, and human beings, and that's studied by biology. So the whole thing now has come alive. It's not just energy anymore, it's life forms. The fourth piece is what Tyler Desha famously called the noosphere. And the noosphere is studied by psychology. It's the sheath of consciousness that's surrounding us. And this is the World Wide Web. It is the internet. It's our ability to communicate on a global level. There literally is a sheath of consciousness surrounding this one-time rock. The fifth level of body I would call the anima sphere. Anima meaning soul in Latin. So the anima sphere is studied by theology. It represents our understanding of our connection to source or to God. But there's a level beyond that. I'm going to call it the pneuma sphere. Pneuma as in spirit. And this is the sheath of mysticism. And my belief system is that human beings are on the brink of the movement from the anima sphere to the pneuma sphere, from just theology and religions into deep, deep mysticism. And the final stage is, I'm going to call it the Brahma sphere. And it is union with source. And that's the trajectory that Gaia undertook, 3.7 billion years ago. This was her, her mandate. This was her mission, and we're teetering somewhere at this stage between kind of the noosphere and the animasphere. But our warfare, we don't quite believe often that there even is a God. So we're teetering on the brink between the noosphere, in which we could possibly destroy ourselves, and real animasphere, where we establish a connection to the transcendence of God, and then move into the pneumosphere, where we experience the mystical side of this. And finally, the Brahmosphere, or total union with God. So that's my third point. And my fourth point is this, then I call it the future of Gaia. And I want to keep repeating the mantra that I've said every single time over the last few weeks. Every single one of us volunteered to be here now. Nobody's here by mistake. It's not an accident that you're on planet Earth right now in 2020. You volunteered to be here now. And one of the great rules of evolution is that in evolution, every solution to a previous problem must contain within itself the seeds of its own undoing. The solution to every previous problem must contain within itself the seeds of its own undoing. Otherwise, we get stagnant. So we've looked at our history. We looked at the great scientific revolution and its benefits. I've looked at the great industrial revolution and its benefits. I've looked at the information revolution and its benefits. Every single one of these revolutions contain within themselves the seeds of their own undoing. It has to be like that. Otherwise, we're not going to continue to evolve. So what does it look like? What does it look like when there are new solutions that the old ones, the other three revolutions couldn't handle or couldn't solve? What are the new solutions? What are the seeds that are planted on Gaia right now? So how do we proceed to grow? Are we stuck in a cycle? So for instance, according to the Hindu scriptures and mythology, we've actually been in this place many times before. There's evidence in the Hindu scriptures of nuclear wars from the Vimanas, these flying craft, according to Hindu mythology. In other mythologies, the notion that actually we've been here before, we've destroyed ourselves, and we're picking ourselves up by our bootstrings again. So is that possible? The truth is, Gaia is going to give us as many opportunities as we need until we finally make the breakthrough into the animasphere and the pneumosphere and the Brahma sphere. And, however many times it takes, that's what's going to happen. And if we get to a place where through our own stupidity, we actually wipe ourselves off the face of the planet, that there is no more homo spiritualis, that there is no more homo sapiens sapiens. There's only homo sociopathicus that destroys itself. Even if it will come to that, Gaia will throw up some other species until a species arises that truly understands its own divinity and the divinity of all other life forms and treats all other life forms accordingly. Now, Gaia herself has a shelf life. Speaking kind of astronomically, we're 5 billion years old. In all probability, the Earth will cease to exist in another 5 billion years, as will our sun. The thing is, this lifespan, will it end naturally or will it end artificially? Because our technology is such that we could wipe out not just human beings or other life form, but literally explode the planet. And so that we become another asteroid belt with chunks of planet Earth floating all over the cosmos. That's a possibility. The thing is, it would not be the end of Gaia. It might be the end of her spacesuit, in the same way that at the end of her lifetime, I'll shuffle off this mortal coil. But I'm a soul who volunteered for incarnation. I needed a spacesuit for incarnation. Gaia needed a spacesuit, but that is not Gaia, is not the spacesuit. So even if it were to happen that we destroyed everything, it certainly would not be the end of this great soul called Gaia. Now, these for me are some of the questions, having looked about what does it mean for me to be personally isolated? What does it mean for a family to be personally isolated? What does it mean for a nation to be personally on lockdown? What does it mean for the planet to be personally on lockdown? This is our opportunity to begin thinking really, really great thoughts and dreaming really, really great dreams, that we can dream the movement from merely the noosphere into the animosphere, the pneumosphere, and finally Brahma sphere. Somebody said, I can't remember who it was, that things are getting worse and worse and better, faster and faster. We're reaching a kind of, the graph is going asymptotic. If you remember from your kind of your geometry or your mathematics, if you've got an x-axis and a y-axis and you're graphing something like development over time, if this is time and this is development, you know, there's a graph that rises either gradually or dips or moves up and down. When a graph goes asymptotic, it means there's an infinite amount of development happening in an infinitesimally small amount of time. And that's sometimes called a singularity. I believe it's the equivalent of a second Big Bang. What would a second Big Bang look like? And I don't believe that would be the destruction of the planet. I believe it would be the destruction of the mindsets that have created our wars on the planet and the breakthrough into light. The only place that this actually happens, light, if you could travel at the speed of light, literally there is no space left. Space shrinks to zero and time shrinks to zero, but mass becomes infinite. So what is like if we were to become light beings? If we became light beings, then we would have a dream and a way of relating to each other, you know, which is not predicated on distance, social distance even, or timelines, but the realization that every single one of us is a bite-sized piece of God who volunteered for incarnation. Let me end with another vision I had of Gaia some years later, maybe 25 years ago. And this was a vision in which I saw planet Earth as a globe. And I could see a grid on it. And it consisted of the lines of longitude and the lines of latitude. And every place they intersected, there was a being of light stationed, and one on the North Pole and one on the South Pole. And when the vision was ended, I calculated how many beings of light that represented, and it is 64,442. There are 64,442 light beings, call them mentors, angels, whatever you want to call them, protecting planet Earth. We are not alone.
So we'll move to a question and answer period that we're now doing every Sunday. Are there questions for Father Strong? Lasse Green, I'm going to unmute you.
I am thinking about all the things you're saying and the house metaphor. And in my sense, in what I'm dreaming in this time of shelter is about new agreements, that there needs to be new agreements between human beings. And I'm just sort of dreaming into what those agreements would look like and feel like to be part of, because everyone's not everyone, but there's so much attacking and disagreement. I find myself just wanting to like agree with people and just find places to agree. And I was trying to think about how that intersects with the house metaphor, where you're looking out your window and you're secure with your walls, but you're trying to open a door of agreement. Something like that thinking, and I was just wondering if you've thought about some things like that.
That's brilliant, Lasse. Thanks a million, Loving. And you're absolutely right. This is a time where we may be physically, socially distancing from each other, that we're spiritually connected at a level at which we've never been connected before. We're forced into a retreat. This is a sabbatical. This is not a quarantine, properly understood. This is planet Earth giving us an opportunity to think much more deeply. And so it's a time for opening the doors and the windows of our souls and making the connections. This is the beauty of our technology. And if this had happened 500 years ago, we'd literally be stuck in our homes, not able to see or communicate with anybody else. This is the beauty of our technology, that we now have an ability to create online communities, to share ideas. What I would ask of you, Lasse, and of all of us, is that in this dialogue, it's about, offering perspectives and listening to others' perspectives. It's not about, any one person trying to enforce their idea. It's going to have to be like this. It's about, oh, here's my perspective. Here's what I'm seeing. What are you seeing? That we can all learn from each other. And together, from the synthesis, antithesis, we can create, from the thesis, antithesis, we can create a synthesis. And that means really listening deeply. And it also means that we have to do this exercise in a clean heart. When I talk about prayer, particularly prayer of petition, where you're trying to influence a future outcome, I say to people, there are various stages of real effective prayer. And we never think about the stages. We think, I want X, and that's pretty much what prayer of petition looks like. The first stage of petitionary prayer is to radically examine my own heart and my own soul. Where am I holding anger or fear or anxiety or unforgiveness against anybody? And I have to cleanse my own heart completely. I can't deliver love from a heart which is contaminated by anger or fear. I'm polluting the water in the pipes which I'm trying to give it to the consumer. So I have to empty my heart of all negativity. Then I have to fill it with compassion. I can't give anything from an empty vessel. It has to be filled now. It has to be filled with deep, deep love, a deep understanding that we're all equally beloved of God. Every oak tree, every banana slug, every human being is a child of God. So I fill my heart with that level of compassion. Then the third stage is a laserized intentionality, to really, really focus on the desired outcome. And then fourthly, it is the total trust that this can happen, that with God, all things are possible. When Jesus Christ said famously, if you had faith like a little mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, and I'm looking at a mountain right now, get up and throw yourself into the sea. And it would. If you understood how the universe works, as Jesus understood how the universe works, nothing is impossible. It's just that we haven't learned the rules of the cosmos. And faith and trust is huge there. So first you empty yourself of any anger or fear or unforgiveness. You fill it up with love and compassion. You laserize your intentionality, and then you trust totally that it'll happen.
Bill Miller, if you unmute on your screen.
Okay. Yeah, well, gee, I think you may have just answered the question, but just to reiterate, in another group I'm in, we kind of agonize about whether, or what is it that's actually holding us back from evolving as a species? Is it simple lack of awareness or knowledge, or is there actually some illusion that we're all sort of buying into that's blocking us from that sort of evolution?
It's a great question, great observation, Bill. And I would agree with you, what you just said at the very, very end there. In the first homily in this series, I talked about, the 4 elements of the journey of incarnation. It was the kind of the purpose of the journey, the ID you need to carry with you in the journey, the roadmap that you need, and then the resources that you have to have. So I'm going to focus now, in answer to your question, on the ID part of it. There cannot be any real solutions as long as we're operating from a misconception of who we are. If I think I'm a human being who has occasional spiritual experiences, that I'm defined by my physicality or my emotionality or even by my intellectuality, I'm missing the boat. I don't have the proper ID to make the journey unless I really, really get it, that I'm a bite-sized piece of God, as is everybody else, that we're characters in God's dream. Unless we start planning and sharing from that self-identity, all of the solutions we come up with will be very, very temporary, and they'll all be undone very, very quickly by people with different identities. So again and again and again, I would say, please remember, you're a bite-sized piece of God having a human incarnation. Now, whatever ideas you come up with, whatever dialogue you're in, come from that space.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
I have a question from Kizzy, if you are ready to go.
I was wondering if you would speak just a little bit more about that very last sentence around the 64,000 light workers and light beings. I'm really grabbing onto that, and there's a sense of fortification, and I just would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Brilliant, brilliant. So there's a great teaching in esoteric Judaism. They talk about the tzaddikim. A tzaddik is a holy person, and Judaism believes that at any stage in world history there are 12 tzaddikim on the planet, 12 holy ones on the planet, and they may not even know who the other guys are, or they may not even know that you may not know that you're actually one of them. You don't know that. But you're operating, you're impregnating the planet with divine energy. Now, the belief system is that there are 12. Now, in Judaism, 12 is just a symbolic number. Doesn't mean actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a symbolic number of completeness. And so in the vision that I had, it seemed to me that this too was symbolic. It was like the way in which we try to understand our globe, or the way in which we navigate on our globe, is by the creation of lines of longitude and latitude. And so the vision was telling me, okay, this is just symbolic. It's not just 64,442. It is actually, it's an infinite number, because every soul that comes on planet Earth is accompanied by angel guardians. If you've ever, you're the mother of two kids, Kizzy. In your birthing room, I don't know where you gave birth to your kids. If you could see beyond the physical realm, the birthing chamber is surrounded by an infinitude of angelic light beings, ushering your babies into incarnation. You have designated mentors who prepared you for this incarnation and will debrief you at the end of the incarnation, not in an interrogation or not in kind of a judgment in any way, but just saying, what did you learn? How did you align with your mission? And what can you do in the future? So every single person on planet Earth is surrounded by that kind of light. It's a pity that our vision, is confined to infrared to ultraviolet. If we could see beyond that, we could see these other beings, every single one of us. Every community has its own special guardians. Every nation has its own special guardians. Every planet in every solar system in which there's life has these guardians. So if we could only step outside of our servitude, or being manacled to our sensorium and to our intellect, and we could see, what's out there. Your kids see that. When your kids talk about, imaginary friends, they're not made up friends. They're dimensions into which the children have access before they're educated and domesticated into believing that that's only made up. It doesn't really exist. So watch your children. Listen to it's not fantasy very often. I've differentiated many times between fantasy and imagination. Fantasy is a faculty whereby we make up stuff that's not real. Imagination is totally different. Imagination is the most important human faculty, in my opinion, in which we can, alter our states of consciousness, visit with entities and energies in those altered states, in other dimensions, interact with them, learn from them, and bring that learning back into this world. Jesus did that famously during the Transfiguration, where on the top of a mountain, he literally had a visitation with Moses, who had died 1,250 years before, and Elijah, who had died 800 years before. And the vision was so powerful that even the 3 apostles who were with him got to see it as well. The ability to shift our dimensions through meditation, our time in nature, our watching kids play. This is vital, because then you'll make contact. You'll see your guardian angels. When I go out into the forest around here, which I do regularly, I interact with, elementals, creatures of the river that flows through here, creatures of the leaves that flow through. I interact with them because I know they're there. I believe they're there. And so we talk to each other, and a lot of the poetry I write and the articles I write, they come because of those conversations. So engage in those kinds of conversations. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Joanna.
The beings that are surrounding our planet. I did some work with the Huichol tribe shamans from the Sierra Madre Range in Mexico. And they talked about the beings that support the planet. And those beings get tired and they need help as well. So when we think about blessing our planet, we can think about asking for help for our own guardian angels, for the guardian angels of our pets, of the trees, and of the planets, because from what I heard, they actually need
Absolutely.
our
Yeah,
help.
beautiful. So it's interesting that I believe that shamanism kind of snuck into Christianity and under the guise of what Catholicism calls, the communion of saints. That there are people beyond in heaven and people in purgatory suffering and then people on earth. But except that I extended much further. Is that all living beings in any realm, whether they have physicality or they're totally spirit entities, that every one of these, is alive. It is light filled. We know from physics that matter is simply frozen light. This is a scientific fact. Matter, I don't care what you're looking at your table, you're looking at the oak tree outside you, all matter is frozen light. If you can unfreeze the light, and I'm going to talk about that next Sunday, God willing, when I talk about the resurrection of Christ. If you could unfreeze that light, or if you could recognize that light in a leaf or in a cabbage plant, whatever it is, that's the life force, the vitality. You need to be in dialogue with that, even in your mealtime as you're eating this. As a meal is a transfer of light between the object you're eating and yourself. So in some senses, if you're eating a piece of cabbage or a piece of lettuce, in some senses, you're allowing the piece of cabbage to experience what life is like a human being. With the taste of it, you're understanding what life is like as a head of cabbage. So there's a dialogue going on every time we eat a meal, mindfully, as long as it's mindful. And of course, the planet is suffering. Of course, where the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution, and the Information Revolution has given us tremendous benefits. There's been a huge cost to pay. Thousands of our fellow travelers are extinguished. Other species have been extinguished. Cultures have been extinguished. Languages have been extinguished. Life forms have been extinguished. We have the technology actually to bring some of those back. But we certainly have the mindset to dialogue with those that still remain in physical form, and to dialogue even with those species which are no longer in physical form. They're there in the etheric realm, or the astral realm, or the noosphere, or the animosphere. They're there in those places. We can still be in dialogue with them. And it's from those sources that we're going to download our own insights as we come up with solutions, for how we do life on planet Earth going forward.
We're all light workers.
We're all light workers. Namaste.